What if the non-stick pan in your kitchen, the waterproof jacket in your closet, or the fast food wrapper from yesterday contained a chemical that will never leave your body or the planet? Welcome to the hidden story of PFAS, forever chemicals that were once hailed as miracles of modern chemistry and are now at the center of one of the most disturbing public health scandals in history. From secret tests, poisoned cattle, and billion-dollar lawsuits to new variants quietly replacing the old, this is the toxic legacy that refuses to fade.
Imagine it's 1929 Chicago, and there's a silent killer in your home. Not a gangster, but your refrigerator.
Right. Back then, fridges used chemicals like methyl chloride. Effective for cooling, sure, but also toxic and odorless.
So a leak could be deadly. And the alternative, well, flammable gases. You know, the kind that could basically turn your kitchen into a fireball.
Talk about necessity being the mother of invention.
Exactly. And while searching for something safer, scientists kind of stumbled onto something truly bizarre.
Yeah, an accidental discovery. This substance that seemed almost magical, incredibly durable, totally unreactive, like something out of science fiction, really.
A white, slippery powder seemed harmless enough at first, and well, it wasn't long before it started popping up in all sorts of consumer products, promising, convenience.
But there was a catch.
Yeah.
A hidden dark side. The chemicals used to make this miracle substance, they started quietly leaching into our environment.
Quietly, relentlessly, and now these chemicals are found in nearly every living creature on Earth. Yes, that includes you listening right now.
So this deep dive, it's not just about some lab accident that became a huge commercial success. We're digging into the story of these chemicals, tracing it back. It started with good intentions, but, well, it led to a global problem.
And we're basing this on publicly available documents, recordings, expert opinions. All our sources are linked, as always, if you want to check them out yourself.
Let's get into it.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with that accidental discovery. We're in 1936. DuPont's goal: find a refrigerant gas that's safe, non-toxic, non-flammable.
And the chemist leading the project was Roy J. Plunkett. Young guy, only 27.
He was working with something called tetrafluoroethylene, TFE.
That's right, TFE. It's structurally pretty simple. Two carbons, double bond between them, each carbon attached to two fluorines.
Okay. So one morning, Plunkett finds a problem. He's got this cylinder, should be full of TFE gas, feels heavy, like it's full, but he opens the valve.
And nothing comes out. Silence.
Weird, right? A heavy cylinder, but no gas. So Plunkett, being a scientist, decides to investigate. He actually sawed it open.
Can you imagine? And inside, instead of gas, he finds this white, waxy powder. The TFE had changed.
Well, polymerized.
Exactly, polymerized. He figured the high pressure inside the cylinder broke one of the carbon double bonds in the TFE molecules.
Ah, so that created an opening for them to link up.
Precisely. Like snapping Lego bricks together end to end, forming these incredibly long chains. The gas became polytetrafluoroethylene, this weird powder.
Now, Plunkett's first reaction wasn't eureka, right? He thought the experiment failed.
Pretty much. He was just going to toss it. But, curiosity got the better of him. Ran a few quick tests first.
And that's when things got really strange.
Totally strange. Water just beat it up, rolled right off. Strong acids did absolutely nothing.
Even the strongest bases couldn't touch it?
Nope. He tried every solvent they had in the lab. Nothing dissolved it. It wouldn't melt, wouldn't corrode, wouldn't react with anything. It was basically indestructible.
Indestructible. And the reason behind this incredible unreactivity, is all down to one tiny thing: the carbon-fluorine bond.
Right. And for anyone needing a quick chemistry refresher, fluorine is kind of a special element.
It's highly electronegative. What does that mean exactly?
Think of it like this. Fluorine really wants an extra electron. It's got this incredibly strong pull. And because the fluorine atom is small, its nucleus has a really powerful grip on electrons from other atoms, like carbon.
So when carbon and fluorine bond, the fluorine pulls the shared electrons much closer to itself.
Exactly. The fluorine becomes slightly negative, the carbon slightly positive. This creates a huge electrostatic attraction, a really, really strong bond.
How strong are we talking?
It's actually the strongest single bond that carbon can form, period. Which means other molecules just don't have the energy to break it. They essentially ignore it.
So Plunkett's powder was just a massive network of these super strong, unreactive bonds.
That's it, making it almost completely inert.
Okay, so this stuff is unbelievably stable, but still just a lab curiosity at this point. How did it go from that to being, well, everywhere?
Well, initially, even DuPont wasn't quite sure what to do with it. I mean, a substance that doesn't interact with anything, that's tricky to find uses for. But then history intervened.
World War II.
World War II. DuPont was heavily involved with the U.S. Army, specifically on the Manhattan Project.
Building the atomic bomb, which involves some seriously nasty chemicals, I imagine.
Extremely nasty. To refine uranium for the bombs, they had to turn it into a gas called uranium hexafluoride. And this stuff was incredibly corrosive.
Corrosive how?
It was just eating through everything. The gaskets, the seals, the pipes at the huge Oak Ridge plant. It was slowing down production significantly.
Ah, I see where this is going. DuPont steps in and says, hey, remember that weird indestructible powder?
Pretty much. They suggested maybe it could withstand the uranium hexafluoride.
And could it?
Perfectly. They compressed the powder into solid blocks, machined those into gaskets, pipe linings, and it worked flawlessly. The corrosive gas just couldn't touch it.
Wow. So this accidental discovery suddenly becomes critical for the war effort.
Absolutely critical. Gordon Fee, who ran the nuclear weapons plant, apparently said they never even looked for an alternative. This stuff just worked.
And the Army probably wanted it for everything after that.
Oh, yeah. They started using it for seals and gaskets, in airplane engines, fuel tanks, anything needing protection from oil or water. Also in plants making explosives, dealing with corrosive nitric acid.
So DuPont realizes they have something huge on their hands beyond just military use. Time for a catchier name than polytetrafluoroethylene.
Definitely. They trademarked it in 1944. Took T from tetra, FL from fluoro.
And on, like rayon or nylon.
Exactly. And Teflon was born.
Teflon. Sounds slick, modern. So DuPont ramps up production under Army orders at their plant in Arlington, New Jersey. But it wasn't easy, right?
Not at all. The very things that made Teflon great, its resistance to solvents, its high melting point, made it incredibly difficult to work with. Mostly they could only mold it to solid shapes.
Like the gaskets and pipes. But what about coatings? Like for pans, that seems like the big application.
That was the challenge. You couldn't really make a sprayable coating because Teflon doesn't dissolve in water and no known solvent worked.
And there was another much more dangerous problem during manufacturing itself.
Yes, the polymerization reaction, turning TFE gas into Teflon powder, it releases a lot of heat. It's exothermic.
And if that heat isn't controlled?
Big trouble. If the temperature got over about 200 degrees Celsius, the TFE could just decompose explosively into carbon and another gas, tetrafluoromethane, releasing even more energy.
And that actually happened.
Tragically, yes. There was a major explosion at the Arlington plant in 1944. 2 workers were killed. They desperately needed a way to control that heat.
So what was the solution?
Water. They figured out they could run the reaction in water. Water is amazing at absorbing heat without its own temperature shooting up.
Okay, makes sense. But wait, you just said Teflon doesn't dissolve in water, and TFE is a gas. Wouldn't it just bubble to the top?
Good point. That was the next hurdle. If you just pump TFE gas into water, it mostly stays separate, even under pressure. So if you tried to start the polymerization, it would happen in one concentrated spot. Still risky.
They needed to somehow disperse the gas throughout the water evenly.
Exactly. And for that, they turned to another company, 3M, the Scotch tape people. In 1951, DuPont bought a chemical from them called perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOA, also known as C8.
C8. Why C8?
Structurally, it has something in common with Teflon, a chain of 8 carbons surrounded by fluorines. But crucially, one end had an acid group, which is attracted to water, hydrophilic.
Ah, so it had like 2 personalities. One end hated water, the other loved it. A bit like soap.
Precisely like soap. The fluorine tail, the hydrophobic part, would grab onto the TFE gas. The acid head, the hydrophilic part, would stick to the water.
So when they added C8 to the water...
It formed these tiny little structures, kind of like microscopic bubbles or micelles. The water-loving heads faced out. The water-hating tails faced inwards, creating these tiny dry pockets dispersed throughout the water.
Clever. So the TFE gas gets trapped inside these little C8 bubbles.
Exactly. They'd bubble the TFE into this C8-laced water, stir it up, and the gas gets nicely dispersed inside these pockets. Then they'd add the initiator chemical to kick off the polymerization.
And because the reaction was happening in all these tiny separate bubbles spread through the water...
The heat could dissipate safely into the surrounding water. No more runaway explosions. Genius, really.
And this suspension, this milky liquid, that's what finally allowed them to make sprayable coatings.
Yes, that was the key breakthrough for coatings. But Teflon itself still isn't sticky. How do you make it stick to a pan?
Good question. How do they do that?
It was all about surface preparation.
Okay.
They'd sandblast the metal surface, creating microscopic roughness, tiny grooves and pits.
Okay.
Then they'd spray on the Teflon suspension and heat it. The water and the C8 would evaporate off, but the Teflon itself would soften slightly and physically lock into all those nooks and crannies on the metal surface.
So it's not a chemical bond, it's like mechanical grip.
Exactly. A very strong mechanical grip at a tiny scale.
Okay, so the war ends, the Army lifts the secrecy, DuPont can finally sell Teflon to the public, and it just took off.
Cook off is an understatement. It found its way into an incredible number of things, often driven by sheer ingenuity.
Like the story of the French engineer Marc Gregoire.
Right. He first tried putting Teflon on his fishing gear to stop it tangling.
But it was his wife's idea to try it on a pan.
Yes. Why not try this on my pans, she supposedly asked. And bam, the nonstick cookware revolution began.
And DuPont ran with that, obviously, but it went way beyond pans.
Oh, absolutely. Teflon and related chemicals like C8 used in its making ended up everywhere. Stain-resistant carpets, remember those commercials?
The magic of DuPont's Teflon.
Stain protection sprays like Scotchgard from 3M, waterproof but breathable jackets. Gore-Tex uses a Teflon membrane.
And because it's so inert, it was perfect for medical implants too, right? The body wouldn't reject it.
Exactly. Yeah. It was even used on the Statue of Liberty's framework to stop corrosion, and Teflon-coated bullets to reduce gun barrel wear.
It became such a cultural phenomenon that mob boss John Gotti got nicknamed the Teflon Don because charges wouldn't stick.
That's right. By the late 90s, DuPont was making something like $1 billion a year just from Teflon. It looked like a pure win.
But there's always a but, isn't there? Concerns started to surface. Whispers about safety.
The first real rumblings came from Parkersburg, West Virginia. That's where DuPont built its first big commercial Teflon plant, Washington Works. Employed about 2,000 locals.
And a farmer there, Earl Tennant, started noticing something was wrong with his cows.
Yeah, he suspected something in the creek near his farm, which ran past a DuPont landfill, was poisoning his cattle.
But going up against DuPont in a town like Parkersburg, that couldn't have been easy.
Not at all. The town basically depended on DuPont. When Tennant hired a lawyer, he and his family were practically ostracized.
Who was the lawyer?
A guy named Rob Billett. Initially, he thought it was probably a straightforward case. Some chemical from the landfill, maybe something that wasn't supposed to be there but was on the permits, you know.
But it wasn't that simple.
No. Whatever was hurting the cows, it wasn't listed on any permits.
No, we know Teflon itself, the solid stuff, PTFE, is generally considered safe, right? Inert. Passes right through you if you swallow it. Maybe some mild fumes if you overheat it, polymer fume fever, worse for birds, apparently.
Right. But this wasn't about fumes. It was about something in the water. So Billett digs deeper. He asks for all the records from the Washington Works plant.
How many records are we talking?
Tens of thousands. Over 60,000 documents, apparently. A mountain of paper. And as Billett starts wading through it all, one chemical code keeps popping up again and again. C8.
Ah, C8, the processing aid they bought from 3M?
The very same. And what Billett found in those internal DuPont documents about C8, well, it was shocking.
What did you find?
As far back as 1961, the same year Teflon pans hit the U.S. market, DuPont's own scientists had done studies on rats. They found C8 caused liver abnormalities even at low doses.
And at high doses.
Lethal. The lethal dose was comparable to some serious poisons, like sodium cyanide.
Wow. But it wasn't just about immediate poisoning, was it? There were longer-term concerns.
Two big ones. First, those super strong carbon-fluorine bonds again. They make C8 incredibly stable. It just doesn't break down easily in the environment. It persists for decades, maybe longer, forever chemicals.
And the second concern?
Its structure. C8 looks a lot like the natural fatty acids our bodies use. So the worry was it could mimic them, get into our bloodstream, bind to proteins meant for fatty acids, accumulate in our organs.
And potentially mess up critical systems, like the liver.
Exactly. That was the fear. And DuPont's own internal safety advice was pretty stark. Handle C8 with extreme care. Avoid skin contact.
Did they do more studies after 1961?
Yes. Rat studies in 62, dog studies in 65, all confirming toxicity, damage to multiple organs. There were even monkey studies where some animals died.
And none of this was made public?
No. Kept internal. While Teflon was being marketed as this miracle of modern convenience, the company knew the chemical used to make it had potentially serious health risks.
So this wasn't just an environmental issue, it was potentially a human health issue accumulating over time.
Right. And then in 1975, something interesting happened in unrelated research. Scientists were studying inorganic fluoride in blood from water fluoridation.
Okay.
But they unexpectedly found organic fluorine too, those carbon-fluorine bonds. And the levels didn't match up with water fluoridation levels.
So they wondered where it was coming from.
Naturally. They asked 3M, a major producer of these compounds like PFOA. Initially, 3M said, nope, not ours, even though their internal data already showed their chemicals were in the general population's blood.
But they couldn't deny it forever.
No. Within months, 3M confirmed internally it was their chemical signature. This set off alarm bells.
Yeah.
Both 3M and DuPont started testing their own workers' blood.
And the results.
Shocking. C8 levels in workers were up to 1,000 times higher than in the general public. And DuPont's own medical record showed signs of liver disease in some of these workers.
And meanwhile, DuPont was releasing C8 into the environment.
Tons of it, almost 10 tons a year, dumped straight into the Ohio River. And thousands of tons of C8 sludge piled up in that landfill right next to Earl Tennant's farm, all while their commercials talked about safe water discharge.
Then came the early 80s, and a rat study linked PFOA to testicular tumors. That must have sent shockwaves through DuPont internally.
It certainly seems so. Concerns grew about air contamination, water contamination, even residual C8 in the Teflon products themselves. They started testing around Washington Works.
And found C8 in the public water supply.
Yes, it was confirmed.
So in 1984, DuPont held a meeting to look at safer alternatives to C8. Did they switch?
No. They decided to stick with C8. Economics, apparently. The alternatives just weren't as cost-effective for the specific type of Teflon powder they were making. So instead of switching, they set their own internal safe level for C8 in drinking water.
Let me guess, it wasn't very stringent.
They set it at 0.6 parts per billion, then rounded it up to 1 part per billion.
Yeah.
Which sounds tiny, but here's the kicker. 1 ppb was right near the absolute lowest level their equipment could reliably detect back then.
So they basically set the limit based on what they could measure, not necessarily what was safe.
It looks that way. To visualize 1 ppb, imagine 1 drop of C8 in 20 huge tanks, each holding 2,500 liters. That's the level they called safe internally.
And meanwhile, the water leaching from their landfill into Earl Tennant's Creek.
Their own tests showed C8 levels of 1,600 parts per billion, 1,600 times their internal limit. And nobody told the public.
So Rob Billett gathers all this evidence, the internal studies, the contamination data, the lack of disclosure.
He puts it all together. A massive 900-page letter, sends it to the EPA, Department of Justice, the Attorney General.
And DuPont.
A few months later, they settled with Earl Tennant and his family. Undisclosed amount. No admission of wrongdoing.
But the problem was much bigger than just Tennant's farm.
Much bigger. The contamination had spread to the public water wells for towns all around Parkersburg. Tens of thousands of people had been drinking this stuff for decades without knowing.
Which led Billett to file another lawsuit.
Yes, a huge class action suit representing about 70,000 people in the area. And around the same time, 2000, a big national study comes out.
What did it find?
It tested blood samples from thousands of Americans across the country. 100% of them had C8 in their blood. The average level was 5 parts per billion.
Everyone. So the big question became, okay, it's in all of us, but what is it actually doing to us?
Exactly. That led to a massive health study starting in 2005, focused on the community around the Washington Works plant. They collected blood samples, medical histories from tens of thousands of people.
That must have taken years.
7 years. A huge undertaking. And sadly, many people in Parkersburg, including Earl and Sandra Tennant themselves, didn't live to see the results.
But the results eventually came out in 2013 from an independent science panel.
Yes, and their conclusions were stark. They found a probable link between C8 exposure and 6 diseases.
6. Which ones?
Thyroid disease, high cholesterol, ulcerative colitis, pregnancy-induced hypertension, and 2 types of cancer, testicular cancer and kidney cancer. This was in a community where the average blood C8 level was 28 ppb.
How much did it increase the risk? For cancer, say.
For kidney cancer, if your blood level was over 30 parts per billion, your odds were roughly doubled compared to the general population. But the scientists also cautioned that these figures might even underestimate the real risk because people who had already died from these diseases couldn't be included in the study.
Right, so the true risk could be higher. This finally forced some action, though.
Yes. The scientific evidence piled up. Regulatory pressure increased. DuPont started phasing out C8 from 2013. By 2017, they'd paid out over $600 million to settle C8 lawsuits. Still, no admission of wrongdoing.
But that wasn't the end of the story for Teflon production, was it?
Not quite. DuPont spun off its Teflon business into a new company, Chemours, and Chemours agreed to use a different chemical instead of C8.
A safer one.
Well, they marketed it as safer. It's called GenX. Similar structure to C8, but a bit shorter, 6 carbons instead of 8, and with an oxygen atom breaking up the fluorine chain, supposedly more degradable.
And Chemours claimed it was safe up to what level in drinking water?
They claimed 70 parts per billion was safe. Remember, DuPont's internal limit for C8 was 1 TPB.
70, okay. But was GenX actually staying put?
No. Same plant in West Virginia, same releases into the air and the Ohio River. GenX started showing up in public water supplies too. And since it was used to make Teflon, well, it got out there.
And the health effects. Did they test GenX?
They did. Later cancer studies in lab animals showed GenX caused the same 3 tumors in rats as PFOA did: liver, testicular, and pancreatic.
Oh, come on. So it wasn't really safer.
And because it's a shorter molecule, it actually travels more easily in water, potentially contaminating even larger areas. We just don't have enough long-term data on GenX yet.
It really is like chemical whack-a-mole. You regulate one, another pops up.
And that's the crucial point here. C8 and GenX, they're just 2 members of this enormous family of chemicals, over 14,000 of them now identified, all containing those super strong carbon-fluorine bonds.
The PFAS family, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances.
That's the one. And they all have these magical properties, right? Repelling water, repelling grease.
Which is why they're in everything. Waterproof clothes, fast food wrappers, microwave popcorn bags.
Waterproof makeup, dental floss, contact lenses, anti-smudge coatings on your phone screen. The list goes on and on.
But the magic ingredient, the carbon-fluorine bond, is also the problem. It makes them last forever.
Exactly. Forever chemicals. They just don't break down naturally. And now they're literally everywhere. From cities to the Arctic. In the soil, the water, the air. And in us.
In pretty much every living thing tested. And the really disturbing part is the evidence suggesting companies knew about the potential dangers decades ago and didn't tell us, didn't tell regulators.
Which brings us right back to exposure. This isn't just about Parkersburg anymore. It's global.
Yeah, I saw that Veritasium piece, partnering with Ground News. They highlighted a study suggesting maybe 23 million Americans are exposed through wastewater, and how that story got sort of uneven coverage.
It shows how complex getting this information out there can be.
Yeah.
And to make it personal, Derek Muller, the host of Veritasium, actually got his own blood tested for PFAS.
What did they find?
Well, the expert he spoke to said something pretty sobering. In all her years of testing, she'd never seen a non-detect result. Everyone has some PFAS. Estimates are around 98% of us.
98%. Okay, but are all PFAS equally bad? Like, is the Teflon on my pan the main worry?
That's a key distinction. There are different types. You have the long-chain fluoropolymers, like the actual Teflon coating. Those are generally thought to be less of a concern if ingested, because the molecules are too big to be absorbed easily by your body. They just pass through.
Okay, so it's not particles flaking off the pan that are the main issue.
Probably not the main route of direct exposure for most people. The bigger concern is the shorter chain perfluoroalkyl acids, chemicals like PFOA, GenX, and others used in the manufacturing process, or that break down from larger molecules. These have maybe 5 to 10 carbons.
And those can get into our bloodstream.
Yes. They're small enough to be absorbed. They can bind to proteins, travel around the body, and accumulate over time, especially in places like the liver.
So Derek's results, what did they show for these shorter chain ones?
Well, the National Academies put out a big report in 2022. They look at 7 of these common shorter chain PFAS and set some levels to watch based on the total amount in your blood.
What were the levels?
Below 2 parts per billion total, generally lower concern, between 2 and 20 ppb, potential for harm above 20 ppb, greater risk, maybe needing more medical checks.
Okay, so where did Derek fall?
His PFOA level was 1.46 dPb. It's pretty much average for the U.S. now. No GenX detected, which is good. But his PFOS level was high, 8.93 ppb. That's more than double the U.S. average, even though PFOS was mostly phased out back in 2002. Shows how long it sticks around.
Wow. Anything else?
His PFHXS was also really high, almost 7 ppb. The U.S. average is only around 1 ppb. His level was higher than 95% of Americans.
So his total PFAS
added up to 17.92 parts per billion, more than double the U.S. median, just nudging up towards that 20 ppb level where they recommend extra screening.
That's surprising, especially the PFOS and PFHXS chemicals maybe he hadn't even thought much about. Really shows the persistence.
It really does. So, okay, where is all this stuff coming from for the average person? 3 main routes.
Route 1, products.
Right, things containing PFAS. Shampoo, floss, paints, cookware, though again, the coating itself might be less of a direct issue than the manufacturing footprint. Waterproof clothes, stain-resistant furniture, even those sweat-proof watch bands. Direct skin absorption is thought to be low risk for most of these, but they all add to the environmental load.
Okay. Route 2, food.
Yep, mostly from packaging. Takeout containers, microwave popcorn bags, burger wrappers, often treated with PFAS for grease resistance.
Does it get into the food?
It can. That citizen science test showed hot water leached PFAS out. Not much PFOA, but more of the shorter chain ones, especially for a microwave popcorn where the food sits hot against the bag for longer. Studies do link eating more fast food and microwave popcorn with higher PFAS levels.
So maybe reheat leftovers on a plate instead of in the container.
Probably a good idea.
And route 3, water.
This is likely the biggest one for many people, especially long-term exposure. Even tiny amounts in drinking water, parts per trillion, can build up in your body over time to parts per billion in your blood.
And certain areas are higher risk, near factories, military bases.
Exactly. Factories that made or used PFAS. Military bases and airports because of firefighting foam. That foam works so well because PFAS lowers water surface tension, lets it spread, but then it seeps into the ground, into the water table.
And now it's basically everywhere, in rain.
Unbelievably, yes. The whole water cycle is contaminated. Studies found unsafe levels of at least 4 PFAS in rainwater globally, even on the Tibetan Plateau.
Wow. Are there ways to check your local water?
There are some online maps for the US, Europe, Australia, showing known contamination sites. Derek actually found a potential link between his high PFAS and water issues where he lived in Santa Clarita using one calculator. Best advice is always to check with your local water utility directly. Ask them about PFAS testing.
It's wild how long drinking water went unregulated for this stuff.
It really is. The US EPA only set the first legally enforceable limits this year, April 2024.
And those limits are strict, right?
Extremely strict. 4 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS, 10 ppt for Gen X and PFHXS. Remember, DuPont's internal safe level was 1 part per billion, which is 1,000 parts per trillion.
So 4 parts per trillion. That's like detecting 1 drop in. How many swimming pools?
About 5 Olympic-sized swimming pools. That's the level the EPA is now saying is the maximum allowed. It shows how concerned they are, even about tiny amounts.
But regulations can change, right? Depending on who's in charge. So maybe we can't just rely on regulators or companies.
That's a fair point. So what can you do personally? If you know your water is contaminated, getting a certified water filter could help. Reverse osmosis, activated carbon, ion exchange filters are often recommended.
But the real solution is stopping it at the source.
Ideally, yes.
Yeah.
Capturing it during manufacturing before it ever gets out. Companies like Pure Affinity are working on filters specifically for industrial use. They use clever chemistry, electrostatic forces, water-loving and water-fearing interactions to grab onto PFAS.
Could those filters work for homes too?
Potentially, down the line. But tackling the industrial sources first is probably the priority for reducing overall environmental contamination.
And we need to keep perspective, right? Compared to things like smoking or diet.
Absolutely. There's a hierarchy of risk. Stopping smoking, exercise, healthy diet, sleep. Those are the big levers for health. Reducing PFAS exposure fits in there somewhere, but maybe not at the very top for most people. And right now, there aren't any approved medical treatments to get PFAS out of your body. So prevention is key.
Interesting point about levels being higher in men, because women have ways to eliminate them.
It seems that way. Menstruation, childbirth, breastfeeding, these appear to be pathways for PFAS elimination, which also unfortunately means pregnant people and young children can be more vulnerable. Exposure happens through the placenta, through breast milk, and kids drink more water for their size and crawl on treating carpets.
But there was that surprising study about blood donation.
Yes, the firefighters study. Regular blood or plasma donation seemed to lower their PFAS levels by up to 30% in a year. It's fascinating.
But not necessarily a recommended treatment strategy.
No, the expert view is donate blood because we need blood. The PFAS reduction is interesting, needs more research, but it's not the primary reason to donate. We just need more solid science on risks and what really works to reduce them. Proper treatments, better regulations that's still likely years away. It's complicated.
So in the meantime, what's realistic?
Well, pushing for bans in non-essential uses seems crucial. Things like cosmetics, hygiene products, food packaging. Some countries are already moving on that.
But a total ban isn't possible yet because of medical devices, computer chips.
Right. There are still some critical uses where we don't have good alternatives. But scientists are working on it, developing ways to destroy PFAS that are already out there, finding new capture materials, designing safer replacements.
So public awareness, open discussion. That helps drive change. encourages companies to move faster.
Definitely. We've seen it before with other harmful chemicals lead in gasoline, freon, asbestos. Research revealed the risks, awareness grew, and eventually they were phased out. Hopefully we're on that path with PFAS too. Again, all the sources we used are linked if you want to dig deeper yourself.
So the big picture. Miracle invention solves one problem but creates this huge global challenge with chemicals that just don't go away.
Yeah, these forever chemicals, they're incredibly persistent. They're basically everywhere, including inside almost all of us.
Makes you think, doesn't it? About the products you use, the food you eat, where your water comes from, your own potential exposure.
And it leaves us with a really big question to ponder. Given how widespread and persistent PFAS are, what's our collective responsibility here? Individuals, companies, governments, how do we tackle this ongoing contamination and protect ourselves and the planet? Something definitely worth exploring further.